Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's talk with KAT CHOW, presenting her debut memoir, Seeing Ghosts, joined in conversation tonight by Bryan Washington. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding community. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter or you can browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask our speakers anything, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. Also, just a reminder that if you would like closed captions, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to turn them on. So in just a moment, I'm going to post the link to purchase tonight's featured book, Seeing Ghosts, in the chat box. Your book purchases make virtual author events like this possible. And now more than ever, they support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you so much for tuning in during these strange virtual times. We sincerely appreciate the support now and always. And finally, as you've likely experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise. And if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve them quickly. So thank you in advance for any patience and understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Reporter, writer, and journalist KAT CHOW was a founding member of NPR's Code Switch team, is an occasional fourth chair of Pop Culture Happy Hour, and has guest hosted Slate's podcast, The Waves. Her cultural criticism and her work has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, on Radiolab, and more, earning her a national award from the Asian American Journalists Association. Tonight, she's joined in conversation by award-winning writer Bryan Washington. His story collection Lot and his novel Memorial have both been praised as New York Times notable books and Time Magazine's Books of the Year. His fiction and his essays can also be found in numerous publications, including The New Yorker, Boston Review, and the BBC. Tonight, the two will be discussing KAT's debut memoir, Seeing Ghosts. Time Magazine calls it a bittersweet meditation on how losing the ones we love indelibly shapes the futures of the living. Furthermore, Bryan himself beautifully writes of the book. Chow's writing is by turns resonant, hilarious, and meticulously researched, making dreams and feelings that are otherwise invisible, potent, and wholly tangible. A delight and a miracle, the world is fuller, stranger, and brighter by this book's presence. We're so pleased and honored to be hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, KAT and Bryan, the digital podium is now yours.
Thank you for that. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you all for coming out at 5 p.m. Eastern time or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I'm going to go ahead and start by reading a short section from Seeing Ghosts, my first book. And it's basically thundering here in DC right now. And so I'm going to read a passage that I always think of when it thunders. When power cut during thunderstorms, you entangled yourself from my arms to play hide and seek in the darkened rooms of our house. Come and find me, you said to my sisters and me during every storm. You raced from the room to hide. No, we wailed and reached for your legs. Come and find me, you repeated. Your voice faded into the walls. We fumbled as we waded through the humidity that dampened the house. We crept into the living room where we suspected you waited and rubbed our dirty toes into the short fringe of the carpet. We took in the profiles of the potted fern and jade plants illuminated by the gray light from the window. Behind those would be a good hiding spot, we whispered to one another. Thunder rattled the house. Then lightning split the sky with a shock of yellow. We whimpered. Where are you? We said to the plants. We parted the fern fronds. There was only inky outlines of more leaves. Where are you? We said again, our voices unsteady. Then a giggle rose from behind the couch. It flickered, your laughter striking an entire matchbook. You sprang from where you had crouched this entire time. I'm here, you bellowed. We screamed and giggled while we scattered in search of our own hiding spots. Come and find us, we yelled while we tucked ourselves behind doors and underneath beds. I will, you shouted. I'm coming to find you. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your reading, Kat. It's so exciting to get to talk to you about your book. I mean, from the very first time that I read it, I remember thinking that I had never spent time with a text whose understanding of the many different layers of grief and the many different ways in which grief is deeply inseparable from life, and humor and elation and also sadness, and a text that was able to illustrate that not only through the narrative itself and like the voice of the author, but also the form that it took. Like I hadn't been privy to a text like that, so I was just really joyous to get to read it and the chance to get to read it. So it'll be really exciting to talk about. I think that my first question is like going to be super general and in many ways like defeating the business of like the book itself. But like, how are you? And like, how has it been as of late?
It's such a whirlwind publishing your first book. I mean, I don't know if you felt this way for a lot, but it's so surreal. And I think that having this book out there where it's, it's obviously a narrative that I worked so hard to make and craft, but at the same time, it's still really vulnerable. And I think I would feel that way whether or not this was fiction or what it is, a memoir. So yeah, I'm just getting through it. And it feels like now the book is out in the world and it's no longer my book, it's other people's to take as their own.
Yeah, it's like, and it feels like in many ways like that's its own identity in and of itself, right? The book is it belongs to you when you're like in generative space or in
Yeah.
research space, and then like afterwards. But that kind of leads into like the first question that I had. Is I was hoping you could talk a bit about the inception of the book, and not only the inception as far as like beginning to write it, but also the point at which you knew that not only this is a book that you wanted to write, but that you were able to figure out like what specifically you wanted to write about, and at what point it became a project that you knew that you would really be fully invested in devoting your time to.
Yeah. I think I very much had wanted to write some version of this book for so many years. And I hadn't realized that I was writing toward it, when I was younger, even in high school or in college, where I was always trying to write the arc of my mother's death in some way. And, a lot of, not a lot, but some of that actually ends up being quoted in this book. And so it kind of becomes this archive of grief of many layers. But in college, it was interesting because I was at the University of Washington and I was studying journalism, but really wanted to write novels. And so I had these wonderful professors who studied either or who taught English or communications, but sort of with this edge of Asian American studies. And I didn't really like class. And so I somehow made it a sort of thesis project to write a novel where I would then go sit in their offices twice a week for an hour each time. And we would just talk about literature, and specifically Asian American literature. So that felt like such a gift. And I remember reading a lot of magical realism and writing this novel that didn't quite have this ghost character, but it had a protagonist who, was a lot like me, and that she had lost a mother. And it had a father figure who was a lot like my father. And the book was just so narrowly about their relationship and their tension. And I didn't really, know what I was doing with it, but it kind of stuck with me. And I shelved that and then graduated college and became a journalist, and uh, eventually realized that I wanted to write this story, but as my own, and to use the idea of taxidermy and ghosts as a way to kind of structure the book and play off of my mom's humor, but also aspects of Chinese culture too. Yeah.
And that's really interesting to think about, right? Like the segue from like fiction to memoir while incorporating so many similar components between both works. Because one thing that I was really curious about was the cultivation of the voice of the
Mm.
memoir itself. So I think, yeah, piggybacking on like what you just said, one question that I have would be like, did the voice change or did it feel as if the voice changed? But also, how and when did you realize that the voice that you captured in the book would be the voice that you'd want to carry for the entirety of the book? Because it's
Oh,
so
yeah.
strong and it's very dexterous and it's also vulnerable and it's capable of being very darkly and deeply funny while simultaneously extremely mournful, oftentimes like within the same handful of pages, if not like the same page, like moving from section to section. So like what was the process like of like crafting that voice and deciding that like, okay, this is the voice that I'm going to utilize? Cause it's like, I know it's like kind of a
Yeah,
strange
yeah.
question. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, one, I'm so relieved that you think that it's funny. I mean,
Oh,
when I finished this book, I thought it was kind of, I thought it was playful and cheeky and wasn't so sure, but I realized this is kind of a tangent, but I think it's kind of a funny story. I remember a couple summers ago when I was really just starting work on writing most of this book. I had coffee with this acquaintance, and it's this young woman who lived next to me in a group house in Washington D.C. And we didn't really know each other, but she asked me about this book because she also is a writer, and I was trying to describe the first anecdote of the book, which is how it opens, and it's basically um, retelling a joke that my mother made when she was terminally ill, and she had no idea that she was dying, but she knew that I was afraid of dead things. And she basically joked when I was 9 or so that when she passed, she wanted me to eventually have her body stuffed and put in my future apartment. And that's, objectively kind of fucked up. Sorry if I'm not allowed to swear here. But so I was telling this acquaintance that story, and she got this really uncomfortable look on her face and then didn't really speak, and then finally said to me, "Wait, so do you have your mom in your apartment?" And I realized that this was going to be a hard road. And um, I found that really funny, but she clearly did not. And so I had that in mind as I was writing this book, where the tone had to be so. And thank you for calling it dexterous, because that was something that I really worked on. I didn't want it to be an over sentimental book. I tried to really not be overwrought, and I tried to be the quickest, like get to the emotion in the most economical way as I could without feeling like I was over manipulating anybody. And my family just has this dry, macabre sense of humor. And so I really wanted that to shine through and kind of be this recurring thing throughout the book for every single character.
a question like on that same tangent, like did you have like a line for yourself or like a formula for when, because it's a really tight line that I feel like is present between morbidity and it's just deeply and like wildly funny, and you are just so deft at tiptoeing that particular line across that particular line. I mean, there's a particular section that comes to mind, like thinking of the conversation between the two sisters, right? Maybe in our next life, my mother said to her sister, "You and I will be together again. Maybe we'll be reborn as mother and daughter this time." The two sisters considered this. "No," Hema said finally. "How about we be brothers? That way we won't have to take care of anyone. They'll take care of us. We can just enjoy ourselves." My mother and her sister roared at this prospect. Right? Like that's really sad, but it is
Yeah.
also like it made me laugh. Like when it and it's just a really delicate and deeply layered thing that I think you've accomplished. So like did you have reservations about when enough was too much or just right or too little as far as the impact or the feeling
Oh,
that you wanted to convey on the
yeah.
page,
I
whether with
mean,
humor or anything else?
yeah, no, no, that's a really great question. I think the passage that you just read, um, I knew I kind of just wanted to keep it as real to the retelling as it was. And I was like, you know, if someone reads this as funny, great. And if someone reads it as heartbreaking, amazing. And if someone reads it as both, then I'll go with that. Um, but I think I actually had a lot of challenges with the invocation of my mother as this ghost taxidermied spirit. And I remember when I was conceiving of that idea, and I'll let the reader kind of decide if it's imagined or real. Um, but when I was thinking of that, I kept thinking, I don't want this to be too sort of ethereal, and I want to play with this idea of ghosts and make the ghost figure very in her own body, because I think that's such a stark contrast to how we normally see ghosts
Mm,
in literature. And I kept thinking about Weekends at Bernie and just the imagery of, you know, these
amazing.
people at this party just dressing up this dead guy and acting as if it was completely natural. And I found it really macabre and morbid and to me funny. And so that's kind of what I channeled when I wrote into my mother as this ghost figure. And there were moments where I was thinking, you know, is this too much?
Mm,
Is it too gruesome? And I think I especially found that when I was writing about the body. But I think that
mm.
there's so much bodily humor, and that really helps with the levity. But yeah, I mean, there were moments where I would have to just put the draft away and then come back to it a few months later and read it out loud and think like, whoa, I really have to scale that back. It's just too much.
And but in throughout the book, like it's just enough. I mean, thinking about the body and thinking of, and I hesitate to call it a distinction because it's part of my question, but it's a very physical book, and physicality is very important in the book, or it feels very important to the book, and
Yeah.
also the lack thereof, like a disembodiedness, feels
Yeah.
very important to the book. So I wondered if, as you wrote the book and as you began the book, you had a distinction for yourself between the physical and the non-living, perhaps, or the living and the non-living, and did your perception of that distinction, if it is a distinction at all, like if it exists at all, did it change over the course of writing the book, and was there anything that felt important to capture between those two states, or within those two states, or like across those
Yeah.
two states?
That's such a good read because that was something that I really wanted to weave throughout the book where so the arc, I mean, a lot of people keep saying that this book jumps around and that it's fragmented, but I actually think it's quite chronological within its structure that I've created. And I wanted the I kept thinking about feel when I was writing this book too, and what feelings I wanted the narrator to help conjure. And in the beginning, I wanted the narrator to, you know, be unable to face these images of her mother or her mother in general. And I tried to really write the body in passive voice. So things happening, limbs carrying people, and things happening to the characters in the story. And I also tried to channel that too when I was writing about the family history and the way in which family members would speak of their past, things happening to them never really being active participants in their own stories. And toward the end, or, you know, toward later parts of the book, I really tried to change that and be very grounded and close to how I wrote about remains without giving stuff too much away, but bones and ashes. And yeah, you're right. A lot of this is about the body living and no, not living. And it really helped that there's just so much interesting context out there that I could weave in about
Mm.
um, what happens to people when they're no longer living or things of that nature. Um, yeah, I was really interested in those forms too, of showing, for example, the story of Neva Dorsa, the woman who her husband was struck by lightning and she basically made a memorial to him where his body was entombed in this stone casket or coffin that you could slide to the side and peer into his corpse that was decomposing. And I was really fascinated by that as a construct. And I think it really mirrored so many other elements in the book.
And it is deeply fascinating. I mean, I think a question that that is parallel to that in many ways is the question of research, right? Because I wonder if you had a clear sense, or if you had a sense, particularly moving from envisioning this narrative as being fictional to one that is more firmly and squarely in and around and about your own life. Did entering the book, did you have a sense of what research would look like and what you wanted to seek out, or questions that you wanted to answer? And did it feel as if those questions changed over time? And did the answers that you found, if you were in fact seeking answers, did they align with what you thought that you would find?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you were in your blurb, actually, your longer blurb that you sent in. You actually were one of the first people to identify one of the grounding questions, which is what we owe. That question is just so woven throughout the book, or at least that's what drove me to write it. That question is sort of laced throughout every single chapter, and every chapter should, in theory, try to answer it. Whether it's what we owe ourselves, our families, our futures, our senses of home, or our bodies. And I found that really a guiding question. And yeah, it was just so helpful, because as a reporter, I think I tend to use research as a way to procrastinate, where if I don't want to write something because it's hard, then I will just read a lot about it. And that's as much a part of the process too. And I think I'm a curious person. And the hard part about this book is that there are so many characters who are unknowable, right? And so the way that I wrote into that uncertainty was by trying to fight it with facts or context. But I also wanted to use this book as a way to sort of show grief as a worldview, or loss as a worldview. And it was really neat to kind of be able to build that world and framework where things could kind of refer to each other. And hopefully the reader would see all these shorthands. So yeah, research happened at every single part of the process. And at some point, I just had to stop when I decided I had enough. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's another question I have, like this question of like, and you just mentioned it, right, of allowing the research to develop and also allowing people to exist on their own terms. Like something that struck me like deeply the first time that I read the book, and then every time afterward that I revisited it, only like further calcified itself, is the benefit of the doubt that you give each person in your life, and each person in your life as they're depicted in the book. So it's kind of a two-part question, but how did you go about deciding how to depict these figures that are like so pivotal to your life, like your mom and your father, right? And not only depicting them, but did it feel as if there were a tension that existed in your respective depictions, like in the midst of writing the book? Did it feel tenuous at any given point? Because it's something that's so deeply special about this book, is the way in which, even if folks have departed in the text, they never really feel gone. You know, it's like a continual relationship, and every relationship as it exists in the book, and particularly between the mother and your father, I mean, they're allowed to like continue, and it's like implied that this is an active relationship, regardless of living or having passed on. So I wondered if that was something that you thought about in the midst of writing the book, and what the process of this, like, including like how to build characters of you know, these folks that are so important to you, like in your life, about going.
I love that question. I mean, I think that was exactly what I was hoping to do, to show, you know, both of these figures, these characters, as ghosts in their own way, who will continue to live on, where um, I wanted to lean into that a lot, and to show that it was definitely a process. And I think that was actually one of the hardest parts of writing this book, was at some point I had to figure out where I was situating the narrator from, and how much knowledge the narrator had at every step of wherever we were in the book. And then I realized that I could make the questions in the interviews where I spoke to my dad or would try and ask him questions about my mom, be a part of that process to show the tension, because there wasn't really, there were so many instances where he simply did not know the answer to my questions or just
Mm,
didn't want to share.
mm.
And I felt that those silences or the lack of an answer were just as instructive. Yeah.
And you really like allow them to breathe, like you allow like the pursuit of the question in many ways to like exist, like to be not as an answer in itself, but like to serve as like, the pursuit of the question in many ways is the point, like to continue to pursue the question is the point. And I just deeply admired it. And also like that idea of like trying, like there's I wonder if you could talk a bit about like what it means to try, right? Whether it is to try to continue to understand and cultivate this relationship with someone who is deceased, or what it means to continue to like try and cultivate like a relationship with someone who's still living that like you want to understand more about. I mean, there's one section that comes to mind in particular, and I usually hate reading people's work back to them, but the prose is just like so great. I just feel like in order to get what I want across, there's a moment where you write, "I haven't wanted to kill you, so I haven't written about your passing. I can write about your death. I can write about the events that inch up to it, and the ones that illuminate its aftermath. But ask me to write about the day itself, and I can't. It's like killing you. I want to keep you in memory alive. But since this is about losing you, I need to try." Right. So I wondered if trying and in what trying looked one way when you began this book, and if it changed in the midst of writing it, and if it looks different now, even like this question of like what it means to like try and then what it can
Yeah.
entail.
Yeah. I think it was hard because at the same time I was trying to show a process. I don't know if this is going to make sense. Hold on. In my brain, it does. Like, basically, I was trying to show a few different things while also having this sort of like, like writerly perspective of trying to actually make
Mm-hmm.
it coherent to the reader. Um, yeah, I think it completely, I think I wanted that to be an arc throughout the book too, of writing to understand. And one of the unanswered questions in this book is writing a form of taxidermy or is it exorcism?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it can be all of the above. It can be neither, depending on the context and situation. But I really wanted to show that and to eventually have this book become an archive and this kind of compendium of loss, not just grief, but loss itself, loss of not just a person, but a place or a feeling or a sense of self. And that was really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that an interrelated question, just like in thinking of loss and like building a compendium of loss and like being able to like write into like hardline, like what loss can look like. Another um interrelated component, like maybe like interrelated might be like a stretch, but also this question of love, right? And
Mm,
what love can look like, and not only like what love can like look like and feel like, but like how to articulate it and to put it on the page, which I always feel like is a really challenging thing to do, right? It feels like one thing to say that, oh, this person loves me or I love this person, and quite another thing to, show a reader that, or to show
yeah.
an
Yeah.
audience that, and to really have it, be palpable and really stick with the reader in the way that I think that you've just done so thoroughly in this book. So I wondered, what was that process like of like it's trying to illustrate the different forms that love can take, right? Love between a mother and a daughter, love between a daughter and a father, love that is interfamilial, love that
Yeah.
extends the bounds of family.
Yeah. I always looked for the quieter moments because I thought
Mm-hmm.
those were so indicative of how it really was in my family and probably how it is in a lot of families, where you can fight and you can say, I love you. And in my family, we say, I love you as high as the sky and as deep as the ocean.
Mm.
But I also found, the little jokes that we make with each other over and over again, to be so pivotal. So, I had each of the characters make this recurring face called teeth face, which is like that. My mom, yeah, it's like that. That my mom would make, and just the act of being able to pass it on to you, or even in the book, to other people mentioned, was really special. And it was leaning on little things like that and having
Okay.
so much detail. But I actually was, as you were talking, it made me think of Benson and Mike in Memorial, and their really complicated love, and also just Mike and his father too. I'm curious how you thought about love too for your characters.
It's pretty similar to the way in which you've approached it, or it sounds pretty similar to the way in which you've approached it, right? Like looking into quieter moments, whether they're quiet by way of like the actual act, or quiet within the context of all of the other acts surrounding them, and
Mm.
looking for moments that are personal, right? Which is like a very like Hallmark card woo-woo thing to say, just like, oh, this is a moment that's very personal to you. But a moment that feels as if though there's like very precise intentionality behind it. And at least in my own personal lived experience, and what I've been able to at least try to do on the page, so those are moments that look quieter, and those are moments that perhaps look more circumspect, and it's not like the bank robbery moment, or like the
Yeah.
completion of the heist moment. Like it's perhaps like the coffee that's like shared beforehand, or like a quiet like handshake or like nod like in the midst of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a really it's a really challenging thing. I mean, but just as challenging for me, I think, is like trying to condense love on the page, is trying to condense time. And I think that is
Yes.
another thing, like just from the very outset, like just reading your book, just like from the very beginning, felt just really special, but also just really different, right? Because it reads as chronological. It reads as linear in some regards, but there's so much. I don't know. It encompasses so much, right? Like I wondered like how you approach the question of time, and the question of also understanding and also illumination, right? Which is like
Oh,
it's like
yeah.
a strange question to ask, but it felt as if
No, it's a good
though
one.
it was super important.
It was hard. So you said the question of time, and also,
Yeah, the
yeah.
question of like understanding, right? And it because there are moments throughout the book where it feels as if though you've given yourself and the narrator the grace to not only understand, but to change her mind and to come up
Yeah.
with a new understanding, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was so hard. I mean, I think in this in between drafts, maybe it was like the sixth or seventh draft, I realized I had no idea where the narrator was in time and how things were shifting. And I realized that I had to have some point where the narrator felt as though she could come through separately from the story that she was kind of retelling, or the
Mm.
memories that were appearing in the narrative. And I found that really helpful, to be able to have the narrator like recount this interview or this conversation with her father, then correct both of their memories. And that was really, that was so grounding for this book.
Mm.
And one of the things that also helped me too was by shifting one of the last sections to present tense. Um, the book, the narrator kind of speaks from a present tense that appears really subtly, I think, in the first
Mm-hmm.
three parts. And then toward the end, um, it becomes so much more prominent. And the last section is told all in present tense. And in my head, I liked that, and I gravitated toward it because it felt so propulsive. And this is really in the weeds now, but it was really neat to find that, and to hopefully show this momentum that could signal to the reader, we've arrived now.
Yeah, and it feels like an in the weeds question, but it also feels like a deeply important question, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it's it because it's so thoroughly and deeply conceived. I mean, the
Yeah.
structure
Oh,
of this
thank
book in
you.
many ways, like it's incredible in many ways. Like getting to ask about it feels like really special. But I think
No,
that
thank you.
mm,
It's something that, it's one of those parts of the book that I'm always so excited about, and no one ever, you're the first person to ask about it. So
Mhm.
I'm like, yes.
Uh,
Um,
uh, I think that maybe a not structured question or like a not research question. And just a quick reminder to folks that are watching, if you have a question, please leave it in the Q&A box, and then try and make sure that there's enough time to ask all of them. There are already a few, so if you have any. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it, the challenge of writing about what remains or like what is undone, right? Like, so it's and not only like what is undone, but like how to write, maybe a larger question, like how to write about like difficult things. Like the challenge is just like writing about the difficult things that are just that people don't want to talk about, and they're hard to explain, you know. Where there, how did you go about navigating like what you include, what you would include and what you would not include, and did you set rules for
yeah.
yourself in the midst of writing the book?
I knew that I had to be as tough on myself as I was all the other characters in the book, and that I did not want this book to feel like one of those expose memoirs.
Mm,
Not to knock those, but that's not what I was interested in writing.
mm,
And I had to hold my character, the narrator, and all the other characters accountable to the same degree of questioning and uncertainty, but also empathy. And so there were so many parts that took me until late last year, a few months before the book really finished, where I would just have these blank sections because I didn't know how to write into those parts of my family, where I knew that it really just required talking more to my dad about certain things, or asking someone else more questions to fill in the gaps that I just didn't have or was afraid to write. And often I found that just simply interviewing someone, um, to answer some questions allowed me to move forward with that section. Yeah, it was, I mean, because it's weird, because it's not weird, but this is both a memoir and also something that I feel like I so tightly crafted in terms of structure in the world. But then at the same time, there would be moments where I'd be pulled out of my own process, and I'd be reminded that
mm,
this is still my real life, as much
mm,
as I'm bending it into something that's contained and it's really just one version. But I think I also reminded myself over and over that this is one way to tell this story. And um, each of my family members read the book, and that was really helpful because they became the part of the process too. And so it was as much theirs as mine to some degree.
oh wow,
Yeah.
that's such a, I don't know, it's just like really lovely. There's, and another question that I had, like in belonging to some extent, is like a tangent of it, is this question of like care, and
Mm.
probably more specifically within that, what it means to like take care of yourself. And there's a moment that comes to mind where you've written like, take care of yourself. I said I wanted to shake him through the phone to tell him that he needed to be more careful so that he could live forever. Right. So I wondered partly how you view care, like what is care to you, like what do you conceive of as being care, and like how, and has, how you envision care, how you care for others, but also how you care for yourself, and how you care for memory in particular. Has that changed, and did that change over the course of writing the book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So much of this book is about how to live in the absence of a mother, um, and how to mother yourself. And you can use, I could use nurture interchangeably with the word mother as a verb,
Mm-hmm.
but um, yeah, I wanted to show the ways in which we were all forced, to some degree, my entire family, even my dad, to have to really learn how to nurture yourself or provide a softness. And I think when I think of the word take care, or that phrase, I always think of something very gentle and tender, not to be really
Mm-hmm.
earnest, but to allow ourselves that little that little tenderness when the world is so damn hard. Um, but I really wanted to show that in the book because my family and the characters in this book have so many hard edges. And the way, back to love, the way that um, as a daughter I love can be, badgering and are you sure? Are you sure you're doing this? Make sure you're okay. Don't leave things on the floor,
Mhm.
little things like that. And um, I wanted to show how that was both tender and hard, and the desire for a gentleness when it's so out of reach can be so big. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Oh, I definitely
um
think so.
yeah, when I think about tenderness and care too for the book and um I think where I wanted the narrator to be at the end was to have this feeling of more tenderness toward everyone else who was experiencing this loss, and also um, sort of feeling not at peace, but okay with
Yeah.
everything and the ways in which the legacies of ghosts can stay present with us. Yeah.
I don't know. It felt. I don't, it was one of the components of the book that felt at this level when I was reading it. There was like a shift for me personally, just like as a reader. I mean, I feel like when approaching this question of like care and tenderness, there can be like a reluctance or like a reticence within contemporary works that are in English to approach like care, to approach tenderness, or to approach like a gravitation towards softness in any way. But your book in so many ways that it just illustrates that it is a part of the world, and not only an important part of an arc of a trajectory, but like a pivotal one. Even I have a few more questions. Just a quick reminder: if you do have questions, please feel free to leave it in the Q&A. On a completely different track, like the one question that like I wondered like every single time that I read this book was like, what books did you use as like references, or like who did you feel that you were in conversation with? Because it feels so singular as far as form is concerned, so singular as far as the concerns that you circle around are
Oh, yeah.
concerned. Were there books that you turned to quite often in the midst of writing?
That's interesting. That's a really good question. I read a lot throughout this whole process, and I read widely just because I needed to distract myself from
Okay.
from this manuscript when it became scary or overwhelming. Um, I read, I mean, because a lot of it too was just simply research too. But I love Gish Jen. She has such a dry sense of humor. Mona and the Promised Land is really wonderful. I read early, not early, but John Okada, who wrote No No Boy, a early Asian American text, and to kind of actually, I read Memorial a few times. And I'm not just saying that. Your Memorial is a really funny book. It's so dry, and the really economical way that you do dialogue too. Um, I really thought of that. Um, Someone gave me a copy of shoot Kevin Wilson's book where the kids are on fire.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Nothing to See Here. Yeah. I thought that book was so funny. And then
That's
I read a
hilarious.
lot of poetry too. Diana Coy Wynn, who is so pivotal to this book. Her collection, Ghost of, is incredible. I read Ada Limon, Baufi, and a lot of other different poets. Um, yeah, and just a ton of memoir, like Sarah Broom, Yellow House. Yeah, Kiesi Lehman's memoir, also heavy. And um, that memoir too was really instructive because just of
Mm,
how he appears as a narrator, talking constantly about the writing process itself. Um, and Jesmyn Ward's Men We Reaped too. Um, yeah, I read pretty widely, and I think that all helped. And I learned something from each book that I kind of brought to my own.
yeah, there's I think one last question before I segue into Q&A. At the beginning, like I asked, like what questions that you felt that you were approaching or that you were starting out with, when you began the book and like in the midst of writing it. But now that, you're on the back end of the writing process generally, but also, publication specifically, do you feel as if though there are questions that you were left with having finished this particular book, or questions that you feel yourself wanting to explore now that you're on the other side of this particular
Ooh,
narrative?
yes. Um, I'm really interested in the question of extinction right now. What does it mean to feel as though you are careening toward extinction? And
Mm,
maybe it's a broader sense with what's happening in our world, or maybe it's in this more filial sense with family. And because I think implicit in that question is, what do we pass on, and what can we really do when we're on certain paths? And I love that question. I think it can encompass so much. And um, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about as I work on some new projects. And mostly I lack the brain space right now to try and even start
yeah, you're
anything
in
new.
it. Yeah,
I don't know. I feel
in
like
it.
I'm going to send you an email about that in like 2 weeks, being like,
Well,
Bryan,
well,
how?
you're like in it though. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah. But
yeah.
that question of extinction is really something that I've been thinking about a lot and wanting to apply to, my work in the future.
Brilliant. Yeah. There are a handful of Q&A questions. I'm going to try and get through all of them. But again, like if you have a burning question that you like to ask, please include it in the Q&A. And the first one is, how did the context of public grief and loss during the pandemic affect your experience writing and publishing your memoir, dealing with personal grief? And an addendum that I'll add to that is I've also seen and heard you talk about melancholy and melancholia. As the progression of the pandemic has just just gone on, and just generally like it's been like a really fucking hard like year and a half, whether it is racist violence in this country, whether it's natural disasters, whether the pandemic itself. It's just been really difficult, right? So I wonder how, and even in the midst of the pandemic, has your conception of like how like the forms that grief can hold and what grief can look like and how melancholy
Yeah.
can change, has that changed even since the finishing of like the draft or the book itself?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm so glad you brought up racial melancholia, because that was such a huge framework for the book too. It's this idea that a few Asian American scholars, David Eng, Shin-Hee Han, and Anne Anlin Cheng, um, came up with, expanding on something Sigmund Freud wrote in a 1917 essay, where mourning has an end in sight, but melancholia doesn't. And the person who is, bereft knows that they've lost something, but doesn't know what. And I think that was something that I kept seeing echoes of when we were going through lockdown last year, or even just seeing, people ask so many questions of, what does, post pandemic look like? I mean, there's no normal anymore. And I felt
Mm,
this sense that we were living in an era, and we are living in this era, where we don't know what the future holds, and we don't know how our world is so inextricably shaped by what's happening right now. And I think that is such a similar feeling to what it means to lose someone, where you have no idea how your little circles and your insular life is going to be upended. Or at least that's how I felt when I was 13 and a teenager and had very little control over who I was. And I think that, the pandemic, there's just so much grief. And in general, it was very hard to finish this book because of that. It was so much easier to turn away and to read the news for 10 hours instead of working on this
yeah.
manuscript or edits. But I think thinking about melancholia and this idea of something that almost becomes pathological, it's so embedded in you. Um, it really felt resonant to what we're going through today.
Yeah. Another question that's in the Q&A. How do you feel about writing a memoir at such a young age? And do you see yourself working with the form in the far future? And again, I'm going to add like a piggyback on top of that, because you talked a bit about the question of like establishing like distance, and like how much distance to establish between yourself and the narrator, and also like what the narrator knows at any given point in time. So I wondered a bit more about the, you know, the formula that you use for that, insofar as like there was a formula that you
Yeah.
used for that, and did you have any reticence about approaching these questions of grief and loss, and just like living with loss and in the midst of loss, I guess, as
Yeah.
like not a very old person.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I always wanted to write this from, well, actually, it was hard because I didn't know where this book would live. You know, like, would this
Mm-hmm.
book be told only in the 4 years or 1 year after my mom's death? And I feel like a lot of traditional grief memoirs happen or occur within that like 2 year space surrounding the death.
Mm-hmm.
But I, you know, maybe that's why I don't really consider this book a grief memoir as much as it is about the expansiveness of loss. But yeah, I made the choice to write this book, and then things were still happening that I sort of thought wouldn't, you know, one of them, and it's maybe a spoiler, but my father was searching for his father's remains. And
Mm-hmm.
when I sold the book in 2018, it wasn't clear if he would ever find them. And of course, you know, things developed and shifted. And so I had to figure out how to write into that. And it really moved up the time frame of how this book would end. And it just requires a lot of flexibility and dexterity. And I think of
Mm-hmm.
another memoir where the writer T. Kira Madden, she wrote Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls. And that book has, it almost feels like it has multiple endings. And she kind of comes in as a narrator and discovers new things about her family. And it sort of shows that, and it just reminds you that this is still a life she is living. And you know, wherever you are in time or however old you are, there's always going to be something new or something that you leave out or something that you keep in. And so yeah, I could see myself writing this book in 7 different ways right now, and I'm sure in 10 years and 20 years. But as for the other question of will I ever write another memoir? I don't know. I love nonfiction because I think that's how you know, I love being able to weave in reporting and cultural criticism, maybe an essay collection, but I'm leaving myself open.
Right, and that's somewhat related to like the last question from the Q and A
Yeah.
box. Is a question of like your interest in fiction, and the question is, what appeals to you most about fiction, as opposed to memoir? And do you have plans to work on a novel? And again, like a
Mm.
slight addendum to that question, what felt possible with the form of memoir and working with nonfiction that perhaps didn't feel possible when the iteration of this narrative was more
Ooh.
novelistic in form and scope?
Yeah. I actually feel like my voice is similar in both in you know all those mediums, and that the act of writing, like, you know, fiction to me probably doesn't seem too different than nonfiction. I think my
Mm,
process would be very similar. But I think that yeah, I think that in working on this memoir, I knew that there were certain constraints, you know, just in terms of facts and who these people are, and
mhm.
keeping it true to the idea of, you know, like the actual beats of my life and my family's story. And so that was really helpful in not letting me just keep like iterating and shifting and trying to come up with different plot points. And I had to find the arc and the story within what I was already working with.
Mm,
And I'm interested in fiction because I think they're also, the openness of it seems to present new challenges. And at the same time, though, you know, for any new projects that I'm going to be playing with in the future, I think that I always enjoy giving myself a set of constraints too and a bunch of roles to work with. And so it doesn't feel too much of a departure.
brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kat. You know, it's a joy getting to talk to you about this book. If you haven't already bought or read Seeing Ghosts, please do
Woo!
so like immediately, just like stat. A few books have like moved me as much as this particular one has, and I'm gonna turn it back over to Kate for the bookstore.
Thank you so much for moderating this, Bryan. It was so fun. And Kate, thank you for having us.
Oh, this was lovely. Thank you both. I just put in the chat one more time a link to check out the book, read more, read it if you haven't already, learn more about it. But thank you both. Another round of thank yous tremendously for sharing this time and this really beautiful and really relevant conversation with us during for all of the reasons that you just talked about during the Q&A. Thank you everyone for spending your evening with us in this virtual space. I hope you learned a lot and felt a lot. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.